Hello, extempers, speech and debaters, and everybody else listening to this podcast. Today, we have a very special episode prepared for you. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about political polarization, which is more of an abstract subject rather than some of the concrete ones that we've talked about, like Afghanistan or like the Pfizer vaccine. But I think it's going to be a super fun episode. Not only that, but it's a special guest episode because it's the 25th episode, and that's what makes it extremely exciting. So today we have Chris Andrews on the half hour. I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, YuYu. So I guess, like you said, my name is Chris. I got asked to be on this podcast, I think, because Spencer and I both have a connection back to Green River High School. He graduated much more recently than I did. When I enrolled, George Bush the Younger was still the president. I did speech and debate through, I think, 2010, so for 4 years there. And I competed in quite a few events, but mostly Lincoln Douglas debate and, of course, Extemp. I didn't do Extemp for a long time when I started. That was a little bit later, like toward the end of my first year, I think. And I just got really excited and interested. It's a friend dared me to do it one weekend, and I just had an absolute blast. It's really just, it's a great chance to just talk about important things and like continue the conversation. It's a little bit weird because it's a one-on-one event. So very strange. So the people who are listening to this podcast, there's like a little bit of like a screw loose, but it's still a really fun event. I went to just a ton of tournaments to do it. I went to a couple of national tournaments, both as a competitor and as a coach for extempers in the years after I graduated. And I've tried to read as much, keep up as much, stay as informed as possible so that I can kind of stay on top of things. And I'm still in touch with the Green River High School team today. In fact, Spencer, you might be happy to know this. They just arrived in Gillette for this weekend's tournament.
Are you back? You're muted.
I am muted. My freaking internet is amazing.
That Laramie weather, man.
Well, it is snowing. I'm connected to UW. I was connected to UW Wi-Fi, which is not great. Okay, I've now changed back to the original Wi-Fi. Okay. Yeah. I heard. So the last part we just had was you saying we just arrived in Gillette. So
woo. Yeah. So they're competing.
Awesome. Yeah. That also kind of gives a good idea of when this episode was recorded too, because obviously this will be in the future, published in the future. Woo, let's go.
Yes, but also before state. So that's also an important thing to consider too.
It's critically important.
And I did get a question for you, Chris. I was actually chatting with somebody and they want to know, like, what's life like after speech and debate? Like most people think that the speech and debate life typically leads people down this road to becoming a lawyer and all that wonderful jazz. I know it's a little different for you, so why don't you go ahead and explain the road that you went down after speech?
Yeah, so I went to college. I know that's a popular route for a lot of people who are interested in speech and debate. You guys yourselves are carrying out the university education phase of life. And so I went to college. I actually studied engineering while I was there. I got a liberal arts degree and an engineering degree at the same time. I wanted to be a nuclear engineer. I was really motivated and inspired by this debate topic I had as a sophomore. I think it was about nuclear weapons and kind of the justice and morals questions that surround that issue. So I thought, well, I kind of want to make a career out of that. But if I don't understand the technology, then I'm not going to be able to make good decisions about it. I need to be much more informed than that. So I went to college, and then I went to graduate school at the University of Tennessee and spent a little time researching at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory there to really like pin down the finer details. I found out along the way that I'm not very good at math, and I wanted to kind of redirect my career path back to something a little bit more speech friendly. But I didn't want to go into law school. I didn't want to take the time to do that, and that just wasn't that wasn't the focus that I wanted to have later on in life. So I wound up in Washington, D.C. I had a fellowship for a little bit of time where I was working at the Department of Energy. And the focus of the work there was on a variety of nuclear non-proliferation issues. So really cool, really exciting to kind of be a part of that process and see what it looks like. I don't know if a lot of the listeners might know this, but Not everybody who works for the government really works for the government. A lot of people work as contract employees for like private companies. And so the government says, hey, we need this service, or we need this analysis, or we need this product development, and we don't have the people to do it. Can we hire you, company X, to come in and bring your people and do your thing and do what we need done? And so I have wound up kind of in that circle, at making a career out of doing, right now I'm doing some research and professional writing, and putting together some publications. So my high school self would be very proud of where I'm at today, because I do things that are kind of similar to writing debate cases and extemp speeches just about every day.
Well, that's a good outlook on our future, Spencer. But keeping this episode on track, again, we're talking about political polarization, which has been a heavy issue, as many of you all know, especially for the United States. In terms of just like looking at elections, looking how policy decisions are being made, what decisions are being made, and how the public has been reacting to that. And so today, we're going to get a deeper dive into this issue and try to understand what exactly is going on with polarization and why it's such a big buzzword that's been thrown around. So we'll actually start with Chris and your analysis on what you think about this topic.
Yeah, so political polarization can be really challenging to approach, I think, from an extemp point of view, because it's a topic that seems really easy to approach because it's everywhere. I think most people understand the way that the American political spectrum breaks down based on the sort of news that they consume or social media presence that they have, and the kind of influences that they're getting that way. And the basic breakdown becomes you're either on the right wing, where you have really conservative opinions, and a lot of that has to do with like culture war type stuff, or you're on the left wing, where you have a bleeding heart and you just want to spend everybody's money and solve everybody's problems. And I think this dichotomy makes it really easy for us to model a lot of contemporary social issues or political issues strictly in terms of, are you right or are you left? There are some really hot button issues that don't really come up as often in speech and debate, like abortion is one example. I think I managed to avoid having to discuss that because it's really challenging. It's really, emotionally charged topic. But that's one where there's a pretty clear divide. Like either you're on one side of that discussion or you're on the other side of it. And so I think there's a tendency in America for people to understand every issue in terms of that framework. But that said, I think there's a lot more complexity than that. And I think extempers would do well to understand that there's more than one axis on the political spectrum, if you will. There are a lot of different dimensions to a lot of different issues. Not everything is so black and white. And I also think that political polarization, while it's a real observable phenomenon, is also oftentimes overstated. What I mean by that is a lot of the rhetoric that I hear around polarization in popular media, especially in kind of the politically affiliated channels like your Fox Newses or your CNNs, a lot of that rhetoric makes kind of grand claims about how we're more polarized than ever. We're more divided than ever. This is a country that's kind of split down the middle, and it's all about these issues. And I think in some sense that's true. I mean, the people who are alive today experiencing America as we know it have a particular vision, and our experience is what it is. But we're not more polarized and more divided than ever. We fought a war over this. There was a very serious, very real issue that literally split the country into competing factions, and they fought over it. So we were much more divided in the 1860s, I would argue, than we are today. And I can also remember this narrative being a part of sort of the speech and debate, the news, current events milieu when I was competing back in before 2010. Of course, President Obama got elected in 2008. And so that was a really hot button issue. There were a lot of racial undertones to a lot of discussions there. And it was a shift from a Republican president who got the country into a long lasting war in the Middle East, actually multiple wars. And we were moving toward a Democratic president after 8 years who had a really big domestic kind of social agenda with healthcare reform being the signature issue. And I remember during a lot of tournaments in my senior year, we went to like 10 or 11 tournaments in a given season. And I remember very early on that year reading a piece out of The Economist that was discussing political polarization. And at the time, we were saying the same things then as I can see in news media now. It says we're more divided than ever. Americans are drawing battle lines, and the Tea Party was really prominent. And so it was either you're with us or you're against us. And I remember citing that specific article in probably 2/3 of the speeches that I gave. There was one particular piece of information about the percentage breakdown of American voters on certain issues, as according to a poll conducted by Gallup in like 2007. And I just use that thing as a crutch. It's like every speech I give, I can make a point out of how we're more divided than ever. Americans are more at each other's throats than ever. So when it comes to political polarization today, I think with the exception of some few really intense issues, speakers may run into the risk of overstating the issue and missing out on some rich discussion because there's a lot more complexity to the issue. And I really think it's a good way for news companies to get clicks and get views, get eyeballs on news stories when you make claims like that. And so the astute Extemp speaker should try to get informed and understand the issues at a level much deeper than just reading the headlines or looking at the poll numbers. Try to explain what the real underlying issues are to any given story.
Absolutely. And understanding like the context much deeper is relatively important. And that's where we're going to get into my part. We're going to talk, because I'm a political science major, we're going to talk a bunch of theory. Okay. I'm going to warn people now, this is going to get very dark very fast. Because this is how the system is, and this is what we actually know. Okay? The real underlying tone is that the United States is really not as divided as you might think. It's actually better than what you might think. But the reality is, it's actually the voters that are polarizing. It's not the people in the country, it's overall the voters. So, since 1994, people who have voted in elections have become more extreme. But also since 1994, the base of the general public has remained moderate. So why is this the case? Well, we actually understand that this begins with political parties themselves. It's the weirdest thing out loud to say, but political parties are actually a good thing. Parties are designed to counteract game theory, which makes their use very important. We actually know that political parties are helpful in passing legislation and achieving end goals. In the first few years of the United States, under the new Constitution and not the Articles of Confederation, Congress was struggling to pass legislation. And this is because each individual held their own beliefs. When the Constitution was made, the Founding Fathers actually screwed up. They made too many checks and balances, which made it very hard to pass effective legislation. So this created concerns about whether or not elected officials would be able to pass effective legislation or make changes that would be beneficial for the country. And one of the things that came across people's mind would be, what happens if we went to war again with Britain? If everybody held their own individual beliefs, it'd be very difficult for us to declare war, which is why political parties were made. They were made to enact effective legislation and to group people together to help the country move forward. So ultimately, parties are really a good thing. They're designed to help the country move in the right direction, compared to what most people perceive as parties being bad and helping to split us across. With that being said, it's also good for parties to become competitive. Democrats versus Republicans is actually better than what most people think. And this is because of how elections work. Typically, the minority party pushes for new and improved ideas and allows for more mobilization of voters to allow their ideas to become elected. So using this simple theory, just to give a good idea, we can actually predict that 2022 is going to be a red wave, because right now the Republicans hold the minority, and the minority party will try to push for new ideas and ultimately lead for probably a flip of one of the houses. So having parties is a good thing. Having parties win is even better. But this is where things are going to start getting tricky. Over time, some things have changed with the way the country is run. As many people may notice, effective legislation is being made, but it's not being passed. So what actually happened? The answer is primaries. The American Political Science Association, the APSA, decided that it would be a great idea to incorporate primaries in the US because other Western countries were using them, specifically countries in Europe. Ultimately, it would allow voters to choose who gets elected or who gets selected rather than a nomination from the political party itself. So voters can now select the candidate that best fits them instead of parties. The primary elections have led to numerous amounts of people to run for office and has created an impact that we never would have anticipated in the US. To keep it short, without primary elections, Donald Trump would never have been elected. This is just because the RNC would have never nominated someone with, honestly, no political experience. These problems have been persisting before primaries, or there's more problems that have been persisting before primaries, but primaries really escalated the issues that we're seeing. It gets really interesting when we start talking about the role of Congress. In today's day, Congress people spend at minimum about 6 to 7 hours a day on re-election calling while in office. This comes from the first day that they are elected as a congressperson. And what they do is they go into a building that's not too far away from the Capitol, and they actually sit in an office cubicle. They put on a headset and they communicate by calling through pretty much like a phone book, like almost like somebody that you get that call for your car's extended warranty. It's the exact same thing, except Congress people, they are going into an office and physically calling people one by one. And that's because Congress people have one main goal. It's re-election. Hey, Congress people should be viewed as single-minded electors or single-minded seekers of re-election. Parties want to win, and that's why that happens. So parties have to adjust to the climate that is at hand. So if somebody is Liz Cheney, for example, who is our representative for Wyoming, is constantly calling constituents and asking for money to be able to run for re-election so that way she can retain her seat. It gets even more interesting. When you watch a committee hearing, there are often arguments and just blatant interruptions that exist. This is also to help allow for the person's name to become more heard. So nowadays you see more arguments then you hear about the issues being put across by witnesses. A great example of this is Rand Paul and Anthony Fauci. The reason why this happens is so Rand Paul can get his name out there. This increases the amount of donations for him. More people will invest into his fund for re-election, and he is on a re-election bid this year, which means that his arguments with Fauci actually look good for him. And he is seeing an increase in the amount of campaign money as a result of it. All of this re-election stuff causes members of Congress to not look at policy, but instead everything is being done by their staff members. So their staff members are actually writing legislation, they're writing scripts, and calling our constituents on different policies. So it creates a severe unintended consequence. Only policy that needs to be enacted now gets passed, and policy that affects the future will become ignored. Well, this continues to get worse when we look at redistricting. There are two different forms of redistricting. There's what's called a safe district and a competitive district. Safe districts are where there is a certain probability that one party will win. For example, let's just say we have District 1, and a Republican has a 20% greater chance of winning over a Democrat. A competitive district is where the probability of one party winning is lowered. For example, let's say District 2 has a Democrat with a 4% chance of winning. In District 2, it's easier for a Republican to flip rather than in District 1 for a Democrat to flip, because a Republican has a more secure chance of winning in a safe district. Competitive districts lead to more moderate candidates becoming elected, while safe districts lead to more radical candidates becoming elected. Think of Marjorie Taylor Greene. Her district is considered a safe district. That's why you have Marjorie Taylor Greene getting elected. The same would exist for an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. A more moderate district would be an Adam Kinzinger or a Joe Manchin. So why this is happening? Well, the answer comes to the voters. Those that vote in the US tend to be the most extreme base of the population. That's why society is still moderate despite polarized news and elected officials. When parties want to win, they will find the method that is best for them to win. Across the country, Republicans have been drawing lines creating safe districts rather than competitive districts. This ensures that the seats they have now will stay their seats. However, when you have a safe district, you increase the amount of safe districts for the other party too. Thus, drawing safe district lines leads to more radical liberals and reactionary conservatives to the general election, and ultimately one of the two becomes elected. Safe districts increase polarization of those who are elected because the voter base tends to be the most polarized and the most passionate of the nation. So why not draw competitive districts? Seems like that would solve the problem. Well, it does, with the exception of the fact that parties would now lose. And having parties lose defeats the purpose of the party. If Democrats oppose safe districts in most of the redistricting from Republicans, then the safe districts they would have become competitive, and there is a greater probability that they would lose, which creates no good answer and no way out. But wait, it gets worse. Remember how we said primaries are bad? Well, we now know that the most extreme people of the nation are voting in the general election. But that's worse with primaries. Think of the state of Ohio, which conducts a primary poll data based on those that typically vote in primary elections. What they found was quite shocking. This data was collected in 2021 and specifically looks at J.D. Vance, who is a Republican running for an open seat in Ohio. Those who support J.D. Vance, who are going to vote in the primary, gave President Trump a 91% job approval rating in January 2021, so he still was in office. Additionally, 60% of those who were planning to vote for Vance said that the election was stolen from Trump. A mere 99% of those who were planning to vote for Vance said that there was some sort of fraud. And in case if you guys don't know, J.D. Vance wrote the now famous book Hillbilly Elegy, which criticizes Trump. In order for Vance to have any chance of winning, he has to promote issues that fundamentally go against his beliefs. Okay? So he has to promote that the election was stolen. He has to explain that we have an increase in the amount of crime in the United States and push that to be the biggest reasons or biggest issues on his agenda. So in short, the nation isn't really polarized. It's the voters that are. So I kind of want to start before we even go into questions. How does this make you feel? It's not really the people. It's really the people who are voting these people in office.
Yeah, it kind of seems to me that the one of the key issues to keep in mind here, if you're an extemper, is that what matters is where people are apportioned and in what districts they actually live. In Wyoming, I'm assuming most of the listeners are probably in Wyoming just based on the connection that the hosts have. That's really easy. The whole state is a district. I mean, Liz Cheney is it. She's the only representative. But not every state is like that. Most states have a bunch of districts. And so in theory, the district is supposed to be like a small subunit of the state. And it's supposed to be representative of like a certain geography or maybe a city or even in huge cities, just like single neighborhoods. But what ends up happening is exactly like you described. The people who are in power realize, well, if I draw the lines this way and incorporate this group of people and keep this other group of people out, that makes it more likely for me to win in this district. So I'm just going to go ahead and redraw the map here and rearrange the shapes in a way that's favorable to me. And then I can put candidates in all the live long day. It doesn't matter what they say. That's a safe district. So I don't feel great about that. But one thing that you mentioned early on, there's too many checks and balances. I think the game theory aspect of what you're talking about actually provides a natural check on like the overall national balance of power. So districts are drawn by people who get elected, right? And so it stands to reason that a party who wants to retain power is going to draw enough favorable districts for themselves, but they're not going to stay in power for a long period of time because of what you described at the beginning, where we can expect a red wave coming up in the next election cycle. So both competing parties here have a stake in figuring out where the lines are drawn. And so they both naturally, by competing with each other, place a check. And that kind of evens out. And over a long period of time, actually, I think one of the results of this competition is what you said about legislation taking a long time to pass. Like, it's hard to pass bills. And I think part of that is by design. This is a big country. Physically, it's huge. There's a huge population. Hundreds of millions of people live here. Can you imagine if laws just went into effect all the time, just one right after another, and everybody has to change their lives? I mean, look how disruptive the last 2 years have been with like emergency regulations and lockdowns and restrictions and, closing borders. It's been chaos, and it's really hard to deal with. Imagine if that was the norm, how laws changed all the time. And if a party gets into power, suddenly they can just like adopt any agenda they want. Like, imagine if our healthcare system changed every 2 years. That'd be just impossible to deal with. And so I personally think the founders got it right by making a system that makes it really challenging for new laws to come into place, because that means the laws that do go in or that do go into effect undergo a degree of scrutiny that kind of protects the people who don't have a say in what the law actually is. Like, your power ends where your ballot ends. And so you're kind of at the mercy of people who are writing the rules. So I personally think it's a good thing that our legislation isn't just churning out major change after major change after major change.
Yeah, I think for me, at least, I feel like I've been really aware of just how our political system has operated and what Spencer had said. So thank you for the mini AP US history and government class. But more so, I think because the fact that safe districts, they don't really have that much competition. There's not much that you have to like worry about. The fight or the competition isn't there. Rather, it's in like the competitive districts in which you have to actually put more effort in and do more so that you can set your side out among the other side. And what ends up happening, especially through that, is this kind of like us versus them mentality starts to brew and kind of like set across all of the voters who are voting, just because it's like a way for you to kind of distinguish yourself as a candidate and like get the votes. And so when that happens, it tends to create a lot of tension, obviously. And I think that's where we think where polarization ends up happening and like where we see that most prevalent. But other than that, I don't know. I think it's just interesting how like gerrymandering is happening and how like now we're thinking about redistricting, such as like in Colorado. And then Spencer, I think you mentioned a bill about redrawing lines. Not sure about the specifics, but that is also like a topic that has came up and is like close to Wyoming listeners, as in like Colorado and Wyoming. And it's just really interesting to watch all of the policymakers and people kind of like freak out about, oh, how am I supposed to draw these district lines? What are we supposed to do here? Is it better if we do it this way or this way? And kind of try to rearrange the population to fit the need of the state. And so I don't know, it's just like very odd to me and very interesting, just figuring it all out, learning about how all of this works in the bigger picture in like national policy and stuff like that.
For those of you who don't know, Wyoming's got its redistricting bill going through state legislation right now. And for the most part, they're looking to promote safe districts in the US, in Wyoming. So there's going to be a major focus on trying to keep districts that are mainly Republican, and keep districts that are mainly Democrat. So that's where we see this problem, is the people who are voting, right? We know that they are more extreme. Okay? And it's not to say that they shouldn't vote. The big thing is political scientists want to know how to allow for moderate voters to vote more often, because that's not being targeted. And if that that was the case, we would see more legislation being passed and more effective legislation for the nation. And that's really where the big problem is when we talk about political polarization, is how do we, the real question besides political polarization, the real question is moderate voters and how we get them to the polls to voice their opinions, because that's really not happening. And those are the numbers that are severely down in comparison. Like a great example of a moderate voter base is like 18 to 25, right? Right out of high school. These are people that we see not voting as often. And that is a problem. And we want to be able to find a way to solve that issue and come up with a way where everybody's voices can be heard. And if we do that, we'd actually be able to have competitive elections and be able to see a way where we have an even like better binded nation in essence. And I think everybody would agree that we want a representative to represent us, right? But it's very hard when the people that are voting and the people that are targeted to vote are those that are the most extreme.
Yeah. And I guess just a quick case study for that. We know Liz Cheney is a representative in Wyoming, and there's always talk about her not getting reelected again in Wyoming because of her stance on, the legitimacy of the election. And a lot of people were really mad that she said, no, the election is right. Like there was no fraud. It's legitimate. And so now her seat as a representative for Wyoming is in question. But for the rest of this podcast, we do want to get to the questions. So today we have two questions. The first one is, what steps can be taken to depoliticize the Supreme Court? And if Chris, you would like to start us off on that?
Yeah, so that's a really, really interesting question. I'm a big fan of the Supreme Court. I just think it's really interesting. I personally think it's probably the best barometer of what's going on or what important issues are people talking about in the country. And I think that's always been true. But one thing I think it's important for extempers to keep in mind about the Supreme Court is that the way that it's portrayed in media and the way it's often discussed just in day-to-day parlance is oftentimes I've found different from what the purpose of the Supreme Court is. It's one of the three main branches one of the three branches of government, along with the executive and the legislative. And the whole purpose of the Supreme Court is to determine the constitutionality of the law. Now, what that means is the Supreme Court, in theory, should be a apolitical institution where they're not advocating for any one interest over another. They're just determining whether the law, as it's written and as it's applied, results in a constitutional status quo, that people's rights aren't violated, that none of the amendments or clauses in the Constitution aren't being met. So that's really the function of the Supreme Court. Politicizing the Supreme Court has become really, it's been in the news cycle a lot in the last several months. And I think one issue I have with the question, and for the record, extempers should never negate the question. Like if you go into a round, don't say well, this is a bad question, Judge, and let me tell you why. No. Your responsibility is to answer the question, but you can explain what issues you have with the setup in the speech. But this question, I think it takes for granted that the Supreme Court is actually politicized. And I think that is more of an artifact of media discussion. And that has to do a lot with figures who are on the Supreme Court, like the recent passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That was obviously a major blow to people who happened to fall in line with her judicial philosophy. And the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett was a highly politicized response to that, partly because the people who were in charge of the nominations and the confirmation, well, they used the exact opposite logic that they had in a previous administration to stonewall the nomination of Merrick Garland. And what that amounts to is a group of politicians who have political interests and want to secure those interests, have an interest in getting judges who will tend to vote for results that secure that interest later on. That's one of the big things that gets Republicans votes is we'll put conservative judges in the courts, and that'll that'll keep us on the right side of the law, or the law on our side, depending on who you ask. So I think the key to depoliticizing the Supreme Court is to understand that there is a difference between a group of legal experts applying a judicial philosophy and making a ruling versus advocating for a political result. One of the examples of that is, if you look at a lot of recent cases in the Supreme Court, there are a lot of issues that media discussion might immediately point to and say, like, oh, well, yes, Republicans and conservatives will feel this way about the issue, and Democrats and liberals will feel that way about it. And I've seen a lot of headlines recently about pretty hot button issues where media is kind of flummoxed, like, oh yes, a lot of people were surprised that Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh came down on the liberal side of this vote. Well, okay, maybe that's because they're not advocating for political outcomes. They're applying a judicial philosophy to the law as they see it, right? So the political conversations that the media is interested in having, and that people who buy and read, like the Washington Post, are interested in having, like, that's not the same conversation that the Supreme Court has a lot of the times. There's plenty of overlap on political issues, but that's not the function of the court. They're not making the law. They're not trying to, like, they're not campaigning for anybody. They don't have to wait for re-election. They're applying judicial philosophy, and understanding and casting the court in that light, I think, is the first step to depoliticizing it.
I absolutely agree. And I think that people tend to forget that the Supreme Court is supposed to be unbiased, right? Like, everybody talks about, like, oh, Brett Kavanaugh's a Republican, blah, blah, blah. No, like, this comes back to, like, the point of the theory where Congress people are single-minded seekers of re-election. And that, I think that's a really, like, important part here, is we know, and obviously this is being recorded this is being recorded before there's any, like, hearings on a judge to replace the open seat right now. And the thing that is really important that we're going to see is the committee and the senators are going to turn around and do a bunch of yelling and trying to point fingers and doing all that so they can get their name heard. And that's how they are able to get attention and get donations, and that's how they get elected. That's the political part of this whole thing. Hey, there's not really, like, an affiliation with the way that things are being politicized with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not politicized. And actually, that might be a stretch. There is probably some bias, hey, because not everybody's unbiased. It's an interpretation of the Constitution, which is going to hold different biases anyway. But the whole point of it is the political issue, and why people think it's polarized is because you always hear this debate between the people that are elected who are trying to get themselves reelected. And that goes right back to the whole part of the theory of they're single-minded seekers of reelection. And that's really what draws those voters, right? And the people that vote are those that are going to be the most polarizing and the most passionate, right? And that's the way that they're going to vote. So really what's going to happen, so kind of just looking at this from the standpoint that it would be, is you're going to see a lot of arguing with the people that are talking to the new person that's going to be appointed, and eventually all they're going to do is try to get themselves to be reelected. That's the issue. What steps need to be taken? Honestly, since the staff is doing all of the work, I think the staff should be the ones that discuss with the person that's being appointed. I think that that's really the step that needs to be taken, is you have, like, the staff members discussing with the appointee and then making the decision, giving them to the legislator or the senator, the senators, and saying, hey, this is what you should vote based off of what we listened to and the questions that we heard and we gave and the answers we heard back. This is the way that you should vote. And honestly, I think that helps to solve a little bit of the problem. But at the end of the day, it's all about re-election.
I think, like, my perspective on this is a little bit different, just in that from the angle that we've taken this episode through polarization and how we've come to understand that the voters are the ones that are mainly being polarized. I also think this could be true for the politicization of the Supreme Court. through media, through what the average citizen has consumed. We've all kind of formed opinions about the Supreme Court, what that means for our future, et cetera, et cetera. And that's caused, I would say, a lot of the politicization of the Supreme Court, of what's happening. Amy Coney Barrett was a big part of that, in that she had replaced Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it made the Supreme Court lean heavily conservative. The Supreme Court justices, they have their own political leanings, and at the moment, the split between the political leanings is 6-3. And a lot of people saw that and was like, hey, that's really unfair. This is going to be really bad because it's only going to be very biased towards one side. And then you see all of the politicization of the Supreme Court, saying how this is very huge, very big. It's something that's going to massively affect politics just because of the way that it's going to be biased. And so I think a way for you to combat that is to have a more evenly split political leaning Supreme Court. In that, I just think that people paid less attention to kind of what the Supreme Court was necessarily voting on, or spoke less about it. In that they didn't necessarily view it as super duper impactful on legislation or on policy in that time. And I mainly think it's because people thought it was fair enough, where it was evenly divided enough to where they believed these people, they are unbiased. They're not going to just vote based on their beliefs and stuff like that in terms of deciding whether something is constitutional or not constitutional. But then if you go with that answer, I think you get to the trouble of having to deal with the idea of packing the court, which is bringing more Supreme Court justices into the Supreme Court. So rather than having 9, you could have 15 or some other number like that. And that's another complicated issue to deal with, and probably something that's not going to happen. But I do think that if somebody else were to step down and retire, like Breyer did in a year, then having Biden appoint a Democratic judge would probably even the balances a little bit and kind of appease to the people, so that it's a less politicized issue, and just kind of realizing how, I don't really know how to put it, but just realizing that if it's even, it doesn't infuriate a lot more people.
If I might, I also think it's worth noting that the political split is, I would argue, based on the way that the Supreme Court has performed this during its last cycle, that a lot of the claim about the unfairness in the distribution of the classically conservative versus classically liberal justices, a lot of that is manufactured, I think. And I think that because of some pretty high prominence rulings that gave a result that you wouldn't expect. If you think there are 6 conservatives and 3 liberals, and so that's how the results are going to be, a lot of the recent results would be surprising. So for example, Fulton v. Philadelphia was a really high profile case, and it basically pitted a Catholic foster agency against the city of Philadelphia, because the Catholic foster agency, in accordance with its religious precepts, wouldn't work with same-sex parents when when setting them up as potential foster parents. So you would expect, if you were buying into the politicized Supreme Court narrative, that the 6 conservatives would vote for the Catholic institution. And by the way, I think 5 or 6 of the Supreme Court justices are Catholic. But so you would expect that, and then you would expect the 3 liberal justices to side on the side of the city, and by extension, same-sex couples. But that ruling was actually unanimous in favor of the adoption agency. And that's because they argued on the merits of the case and not on the headlines of the issue. And so that was a surprising result. And then shortly after that, Republicans brought a challenge to the Affordable Care Act. So Obama's signature domestic policy, they brought before the Supreme Court. But then the court did not go, they didn't go along with what the Republicans wanted. So it was a 7-2 vote. Gorsuch dissented and Alito dissented. But they basically said, no, this is still constitutional. Right? So Amy Coney Barrett, this highly politicized personality, and Brett Kavanaugh, this highly politicized personality that a lot, depending on how far left the farther left you go in the media narrative, the more doomsaying there is about the appointment of these two people. They actually sided against the Republicans on this because, as I said before, they're not advocating for political results. They're applying judicial philosophies, and those are two very different things, I think.
And I just want to clarify.
That's just one guy's take on it.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. Like, I'm not saying, oh, the Supreme Court is heavily politicized right now, and they're doing a lot, and that's the political leanings is exactly how these decisions are playing out. Because they did, like, they did legitimize the election. They were like, yeah, it's not fake and stuff like that. And they made a lot of decisions that were very surprising to a lot of people who did seek out to see what happened with these decisions that they were making. But I do think that the way media has portrayed the Supreme Court and how they're kind of exploiting the fact that there's like an uneven split of political leanings within the Supreme Court, that is what really kind of gets to people and like triggers people. And so I think like balancing that out a little bit would be a better way of just like not let media do that, just so it's like even. But then again, that's just my take.
And I think there's one other thing to add on Chris's thought. There's this really like highly politicized thing that, with the way the court is, one of the abortion laws is going to be, we're going to see abortion become now this real big constitutional thing, or whatever. There's this thing called judicial review. Okay. And judicial review is really important to understand because typically when judicial review occurs, it's upheld from the first time. Okay. So what normally happens is you have the debate is, we're going to see Roe v. Wade become overturned. That's not usually what happens in judicial review. Judicial review takes a case that looks like it is possibly similar to that, and it reviews it compared to a previous case that has occurred, i.e. Roe v. Wade. So there's the discussion. I think it's, I don't remember off the top of my head. I believe it's the Mississippi abortion law that's being discussed. It might be Mississippi or Alabama. Can't remember the two off the top of my head, which one it was. But one of them is in the Supreme Court. It is being discussed. What's going to happen is this is a pure example of judicial review. Okay, all this is trying to debate whether Roe v. Wade was right the first time. And usually the answer is that it will be upheld again. Okay? And that's what happens with judicial review. Okay? We mentioned this back in our Texas abortion law episode. Can't remember the exact name of it, but judicial review typically sees upholding rather than polarization. And I think that is another key takeaway from what Chris has said is it's not just you would expect it to be 6 one way and 3 the other. No, what you're going to expect is a surprising outcome, and it's going to be the power of judicial review that will show that, yeah, that abortion debate that goes to the Supreme Court is probably going to be struck down.
Yeah, a lot of 5-4 decisions still. So the second question that we also want to get to is, can independent state-level redistricting commissions solve America's gerrymandering problems? So some of what we've already talked about beforehand.
Yeah, this one's a really interesting question. I guess I would need to know more about what those commissions would look like. I think generally speaking, one thing you might be able to say is that like this is analogous to some other issues like for example, not every state has the same primary structure when it comes to primaries. Like the state parties determine how that happens. Not every state has the same, like states don't have term limits or the age limits on people who can go represent them in Congress, like in the House or the Senate. Like there's no age limit on being a senator. And a lot of people advocate for that. They say, like, okay, after X number of terms, we need to get somebody else in here. And I guess from a national point of view, I mean, maybe there's some arguments for that, but I think this issue and the gerrymandering issue in the state level commission, this is like those issues in that it speaks to the right of a population to govern itself, or at least have some say in how it is governed. There's a reason that The House of Representatives is supposed to be more representative of like the distribution of people in America. And then the Senate is supposed to be an equal forum for the states. I mean, that's why little Wyoming has the same number of senators as gigantic New York or California. And I think when it comes to redrawing districts and gerrymandering, you have a lot of state level politicians and political interests who are feeding into like a national pipeline, so to speak. And that ultimately kind of supports the party, whatever the party happens to be that's like predominant in that state. And so to me, it seems like that would be just another political battleground. And it comes down to like whatever state is in power is going to be able to hold the pen, so to speak, on how to draw the districts. And to me, it seems like even though they're independent, I don't know how you would set that up aside from having ties back to political interests, because whether it's the governor who appoints a commission or it's like state legislators who comprise or appoint some kind of commission, either way, it's coming from somebody with a political interest. And I think that doesn't necessarily address the fundamental problem, which is that there's a connection between how the lines are drawn and the political interests of people who are trying to retain power. Spencer, what's that phrase you keep using for how to describe politicians? Single-minded
seekers of re-election.
Yes, exactly. And so to me, even though even an independent commission is still going to be connected to that power structure, and they're still going to be serving the interests of the people who are single-mindedly seeking re-election. And so to me, the answer to this question, if I'm an extemper, is no, it can't.
I will agree with Chris. So I actually just pulled it up. There's a few states now that do have independent commissions. Those are, just to give some people some help, they are Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Michigan, Montana, New York, and Washington State. And some of the states do limit commission members linked to any sort of any link of legislature. They also bar legislative staff from serving on the commission. Some of those states also bar lobbyists from serving. Hey, but here's kind of the thing that Chris is explaining that I'll even further on. Even though that says connection to the legislature, some of those states do appoint or do have the independent commissions appointed by the governor, okay, which is still the same problem that's existing now, just a very different method of such. There's also the thought of even if it was just commissioned like by independent people, maybe it's appointed by a lobbyist organization or by constituents of representatives or even just people getting selected, right? There's going to be some bias. Those lines are still going to be drawn in the form of safe districts and competitive districts. The same problems still exist. So redistricting is just an issue within itself. And it's an issue that's on top of what is a very big mess of the US political system of change over time, and has resulted in a lot of this, as we talked about, this extremism that we're seeing, right? Or what people see as extremism, I guess you can say it that way. But this is what leads to more polarizing candidates becoming elected, or things that are being said to continue to occur through the cycle, right? Because you have to appeal to this base that are going to try to vote for you because safe districts exist, right? So independent commissions don't do anything. They don't solve this problem. And that's an important thing to note. A lot of people think that they would, and it's right to think that they would, but there's still going to be that connection anyway. I think even with an independent commission, and I might be mistaken on this. Yeah, it doesn't say this on this website, so I'm going to use my word as truth. But I think even with an independent commission, once the lines are drawn, it has to go into Congress anyway. So it's going to have to get passed, which means it can be amended, which means that it can be redrawn anyway. So at the end of the day, like it doesn't really do anything. The problem's going to go right back to and you also have to consider, like, who are the people that get to change, who get to move it to independent state level commissions? Oh, wait, it's the Congress people. Why are they going to do that? Hey, why are they going to do that when they can have the power to draw their own lines? Like, it's not going to solve anything. And it's quick for one of those states that I listed to, in the legislature, remove it, repeal it. So they've got the power to do that. So ultimately, like, there's not really a good point to that because I think it will backfire on the end and the same issues will persist.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could like say yes to this question either. Just because I think if you like look at the main reasons why we have gerrymandering in the first place, it's because like one of the reasons is because they don't want Congress people to be solely focused on re-election. Whether or not that does end up working, but like one of the reasons why they would want to keep gerrymandering is because of that. For multiple other reasons too, just so that your party can also stay in power during elections and stuff like that. But at the same time, if you take that into account, then it's really hard to say yes to me, because at its core, gerrymandering is something that many people value, in that they think it's a good idea. They think like it's okay to do. It's why we've been doing it, and it's been done like everywhere, basically. So if you take that into account, then it's really hard for just like independent state level redistricting commissions to do anything about that or against that if it's what they are kind of there to do. Anyway, so with that, I don't really think you can say yes to this question. Probably don't say yes to this question and just go with a no. Solid as that. And that's all I really have to contribute to that. So if no one else has anything more to add, I think it's been a pretty great episode. A lot of good information, a repeat maybe of your AP US history and government class, but still very knowledgeable information put into context. I think that we had a great time. I mean, I had a great time. So thank you so much, Chris, for coming on this episode.
Yeah, it was great to be on. Sorry to, I feel like I talked way too much. I think you're going to have to change the name of the show to the full hour.
That ends up happening too. Like the first couple of episodes have been a full hour, but I don't know. We see the value in it. With the magic of editing, maybe it'll be 45 minutes instead of a full hour. But I hope you get the one in the round. I hope you do well. And if you don't, let us know how you did. Let us know how we did. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM me, Spencer, or email us, or even get in contact with Chris if you have his contact information and would like to. We could all provide information to you, answer any questions that you have. If you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please click the subscribe button, ring the bell so that you don't miss any notifications and get early access to episodes that don't release on the One Clap podcast until the day after. And follow our socials. Follow us at the Half Hour Extemp podcast on Instagram and on Twitter. We do polls there. Let us know what you want to hear. Thank you all so much for your support and love. We will see you next time.
Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, we will see you all later.